Here you go, one apple pie.
Oh, it looks wonderful.
Thank you, Lily.
You're very welcome. Enjoy. Delicious.
Told you so.
Glad you like it.
I want to ask you something, and I want you to really sit with it before you answer. If a man treated you like you didn't exist, like you were invisible, like you were staff in your own home, what would you do? Would you leave? Most people say they would. But what if leaving wasn't the bravest option? What if staying and simply being exactly who you are was the most powerful thing you could do? This is the story of a woman who never fought back, never raised her voice, never demanded to be seen, and somehow she won everything. Her name is Lily Mae, and what she did in that house will make you question everything you think you know about strength, status, and what it really means to hold power. Before we go any further, I need to be honest with you about something. This story is going to make you uncomfortable. Not in the way a horror film makes you uncomfortable, but in the quiet, creeping way that happens when you recognize yourself in someone else's pain. When you see your own life reflected in a stranger's silence. When a story reaches through the screen and says, "I know you have been here too." What you are about to hear is the story of two people who should never have met. A woman from a small, quiet corner of Kentucky, where everybody knows your name and nobody locks their doors, and a man from a world so far removed from hers that they might as well have been living on different planets. One of them had everything the world says you are supposed to want. The other had something the world rarely thinks to measure. And it is only by the end of this story that you will understand which one of them was actually rich. This is what she never asked for. There is a town in eastern Kentucky called Harlan. If you have never been there, you might know it from headlines. It has had its share of hard times, the kind that happen to places the rest of the country decides are too far away to matter. But people who are from Harlan will tell you something the headlines never do. They will tell you that Harlan is also a place of extraordinary loyalty, of neighbors who show up when things go wrong without being asked, of women who hold families together through winters that are long and cold and unforgiving, not because anyone is watching, but because that is simply what you do. That is the town where Lily Mae Harmon grew up, and it shaped her in ways that a man like Carter Whitfield would spend 2 years failing to understand, and the rest of his life being grateful for. Lily Mae was the second of 3 children born to Robert and Sandra Harmon. Her father worked at the county maintenance department, the kind of job that keeps the roads passable in January and the bridges safe in March, and gets very little credit for either. Her mother cleaned houses 3 days a week and spent the other 4 making their own home, something worth coming back to. They were not poor in the way that breaks people. They were modest in the way that teaches people, that things cost something, that people matter more than objects, and that how you treat someone when you have nothing to offer them tells you everything about your character. Lily Mae graduated from Harlan County High School in the spring, second in her class. She had been accepted to a small state university about 2 hours away, a fact that her teachers celebrated and her parents cried over, not because they weren't proud, but because they were running the numbers in their heads at the same time. Her father had a medical bill that year. Her younger brother needed braces. The small savings account that had been earmarked for her tuition had a slow, quiet leak that nobody talked about openly at the dinner table, but everyone felt. And Lily Mae, who had always been the kind of person who noticed the things nobody said out loud, folded up her acceptance letter, slid it into the drawer of her childhood desk, and began working more hours at the diner on Route 25E, where she had been a weekend waitress since she was 16. She did not do this with drama. She did not do it with resentment. She did it the way she did most things, with a kind of steady, unhurried grace that people around her took for granted precisely because it never wavered. And this is important. This is one of the first things you need to understand about Lily Mae Harmon, because it will be the key to everything that comes later. She was not passive. She was not someone who simply accepted whatever life handed her and smiled through the pain. She was someone who had made a decision, at some point early in her life, that her circumstances did not get to determine her character, that the way she treated people on her worst day would be the same as the way she treated them on her best, that kindness was not a resource she could run out of, that dignity was not something anyone else could take from her unless she handed it over willingly. She never handed it over. Her co-workers at the diner knew her as the one who remembered every regular's order without writing it down, who stayed late without being asked when someone called in sick, who brought homemade biscuits on slow Tuesday mornings just because she thought people deserved something warm. The elderly women in her church knew her as the girl who sat with the ones whose families lived far away and didn't visit enough. The children in her neighborhood knew her as the one who always had time to wave, to stop, to ask your name, and actually remember it the next time she saw you. Nobody in Harlan would have told you Lily Mae Harmon was extraordinary, because in Harlan, that kind of goodness was the standard people aspired to, the thing you were raised toward. But they would have told you she was the real thing. And in a world full of performances, the real thing is rarer than anyone likes to admit. Before we go any further, we'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your city or country in the comments below. We read every single one, and it means the world to this community. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, let's continue. Carter Whitfield was 44 years old, and if you had asked the world to describe him, the world would have used the word successful so many times it would have started to sound hollow. His private equity firm, Whitfield Capital Group, managed over $9 billion in assets. He had been on the Forbes 400 list for 4 consecutive years. He owned a 40-room estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, a penthouse in Midtown Manhattan that he rarely slept in, a ski lodge in Vail he visited twice a year, and a vineyard in Napa he had purchased as an investment and never once visited for pleasure. He employed over 300 people directly and had indirect influence over thousands more. He donated to 3 major hospitals, 2 university endowments, and a children's literacy foundation, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had enough money that the tax structure made it logical. And Carter Whitfield was, above all else, a man who found comfort in logic. He had not always been this way. There is a version of Carter Whitfield that existed before the money, before the board seats, before the profile in the Wall Street Journal that his mother had laminated and kept in her kitchen drawer. That version grew up in a 2-bedroom house in Akron, Ohio, the only child of a school nurse named Margaret and a man named Douglas who sold insurance and coached Little League on weekends, and died of a heart attack when Carter was 19, one semester into his sophomore year at Ohio State. Carter did not take a leave of absence. He did not go home to grieve. He took out additional loans, switched his major to finance, graduated in 3 years, and never fully stopped running from the moment his father's casket was lowered into the November ground. Grief does things to people that they don't always recognize as grief. It disguises itself. It shows up as ambition, as control, as an obsessive need to make sure that the thing that devastated you, the sudden, arbitrary, unfair loss of something you depended on, can never happen again. And the only way some people know how to protect themselves from that kind of loss is to stop depending on anything they cannot control. Carter Whitfield had not consciously decided to avoid love. He had simply, over the course of 25 years, become very good at avoiding need. And love, at its core, is a form of need. It is the admission that another person has the power to unmake you. Carter had worked too hard and come too far to be unmade by anyone. His colleagues respected him the way you respect a force of nature, not warmly, but sincerely. They knew he was brilliant. They knew he was fair, in the transactional sense of the word. They knew that when Carter Whitfield gave you his word, it was good, because Carter Whitfield understood that a reputation was a balance sheet, and his had to stay clean. But they also knew, the ones who had worked with him long enough, that something essential was missing from his life. The way a beautiful building can be architecturally perfect and still feel cold inside, because nobody ever thought to put curtains on the windows or flowers on the table. His mother, Margaret Whitfield, had been thinking about this for years. Margaret was 71 years old and still sharp enough to notice everything her son tried to hide from her. She had watched him attend 4 of his friends' weddings in the past decade as the best man, always the best man, never the groom. She had watched him buy a house with 40 rooms and fill 39 of them with furniture he had hired someone else to select. She had watched him work through Thanksgiving twice and miss Christmas once because of a deal that closed on December 23rd and that he later admitted, in a rare, unguarded moment, had not actually required his personal presence on that specific day. She had watched her son build an empire with the diligence and precision of a master architect, and she had watched him live inside it the way a person lives inside a hotel, efficiently temporarily, without ever really settling in. She had brought up marriage before, more than once. Carter's responses ranged from polite deflection to outright refusal, delivered with the kind of calm certainty he used in boardrooms when he had already decided an acquisition wasn't worth pursuing. He was too busy. He hadn't met the right person. He didn't need the complication. The right woman would come along when the time was right, and the time was never right. And Margaret had finally understood, on a quiet Sunday evening in October, that the time was never going to be right, because Carter had unconsciously arranged his entire life to ensure it couldn't be. And waiting for him to figure that out on his own was going to take longer than she had. She made a decision. Margaret had a friend from her nursing years named Dorothy, who had grown up in Harlan, Kentucky. They had met during a conference in Louisville in 1987, bonded over terrible hotel coffee and a shared contempt for a particularly pompous keynote speaker, and had stayed in touch in the way that people from an earlier generation stayed in touch. Handwritten Christmas cards, occasional phone calls that lasted longer than expected, the kind of friendship that doesn't require constant maintenance because its roots go deep enough to survive long silences. Dorothy had moved back to Harlan after retirement, and in their last phone call, she had said something that lodged itself in Margaret's memory like a splinter. She had said, "The women here are different. They're not impressed by the wrong things. And the ones who are truly good, you can feel it the moment you're in the room with them." Margaret thought about that for 3 months. She thought about it while folding laundry and driving to the pharmacy, and sitting alone in the kitchen at night with a cup of tea that went cold, while she stared at the photograph of her son on the refrigerator, the one from his college graduation, before the armor had fully set. And then one morning in late January, she packed an overnight bag, called Dorothy to let her know she was coming, and bought a bus ticket to Harlan, Kentucky. She did not tell Carter she was going. She did not tell him why. She told him she was visiting an old friend, which was true, and she left the rest unsaid, which was something Margaret Whitfield had learned to be very good at over the course of her 71 years. She understood, with the particular wisdom of a mother who has watched her child build walls around himself, brick by careful brick, that some things cannot be announced. They have to be done. The bus ride was 4 hours. Margaret spent it watching the landscape change, the flat predictability of the Ohio suburbs giving way to the rolling insistence of the Appalachian foothills, the trees thickening, the sky pressing lower, the whole world becoming more intimate and more serious at the same time. There is something about those mountains that does something to a person who is paying attention. They remind you that the world was here long before your problems and will be here long after, and that the only reasonable response to that fact is to stop pretending your pride is more important than the people you love. She arrived in Harlan on a Wednesday afternoon and spent the first evening with Dorothy, catching up over a dinner that Dorothy had cooked herself and that tasted the way food tastes when someone made it, because they wanted to, not because they had to. The next morning, she asked Dorothy to take her around town. Not to tourist spots. Harlan didn't have tourist spots in the traditional sense, but to the places where the community actually lived. The diner, the church on the hill, the community center where the older residents gathered on Thursday mornings for coffee and conversation. And it was at the diner, on that Thursday morning, over a cup of coffee that was significantly better than the hotel coffee she and Dorothy had bonded over 30 years ago, that Margaret asked the question she had come 4 hours by bus to ask. She asked the woman behind the counter, a woman named June who had been working that same counter for 22 years and who had the particular authority that comes with knowing everyone's business without ever being unkind about it. She asked her, "Is there a young woman in this town who is known for her character? Not her looks, not her family name. Her character." June set down the coffee pot. She looked at Margaret for a moment, the way you look at someone when you're deciding whether they deserve an honest answer. And then she said, without any hesitation at all, "Lily Mae Harmon," and two of the regulars at the counter, men who hadn't appeared to be listening, both nodded without looking up from their plates. Margaret asked where she could find her. She found Lily Mae that afternoon, finishing a shift at the same diner. It turned out June had called ahead, the way people do in small towns, so that by the time Margaret walked back in at 2 o'clock, Lily Mae was expecting her but didn't know why. They sat in a corner booth. Margaret ordered more coffee she didn't need and told Lily Mae, plainly and without theatrical buildup, exactly who she was and why she had come. She said her son was a good man who had forgotten how to let people in. She said she believed that the right woman could remind him. She said she was not asking Lily Mae to fix him. She was very clear about this. She was asking whether Lily Mae might be willing to give a marriage a chance to a man who was going to resist it, in a world that was going to be very different from the one she had grown up in. There was a long silence. Lily Mae looked out the window at the January street. A truck drove past. Somewhere nearby, someone dropped something metal that rang against the sidewalk and then went quiet. And then Lily Mae asked Margaret 3 questions. She asked what kind of man Carter was when something went wrong and there was nothing to gain from being decent. She asked whether Margaret believed he was capable of changing. And she asked whether Margaret was prepared to be honest with her if things went badly. Margaret answered yes to all 3, and she answered without flinching, which was the only thing that could have convinced Lily Mae that she meant it. Lily Mae went home that evening and sat at the kitchen table with her parents for 2 hours. Her mother cried twice. Her father didn't say much, but he held Lily Mae's hand across the table for a long time, which was its own kind of answer. And by the end of the evening, something had shifted in the room. The shift that happens when a family recognizes that their child is standing at the edge of a life they can't follow her into, and all they can do is trust that they raised her well enough to find her own way back to herself if things get hard. Lily Mae Harmon said yes. Margaret came home from Kentucky on a Friday evening and told her son on Saturday morning. She sat across from him at the kitchen table of his Greenwich estate, a kitchen with marble countertops and a range that cost more than most people's cars and that was used primarily to boil water for coffee, and she told him she had found him a wife. She told him the wedding would be in 6 weeks. She told him the girl's name was Lily Mae Harmon and that she was from Kentucky and that she was the finest young woman Margaret had encountered in a very long time, and that she fully expected him to hate this conversation.
Carter,
and
I
that she
found
was
you a
having
wife.
it anyway.
You what?
What
A
followed was the
wife?
closest
You
thing
need
to an
stability.
argument that
I've
Carter
arranged
and
it.
Margaret
You can't
Whitfield
do
had
this. I'm
had
not
in
marrying
20
a stranger.
It's done.
Carter
You'll
was
thank
controlled
me.
in the way that very powerful men are controlled when they are furious. His voice stayed even, his hands stayed still, and the temperature in the room dropped about 10 degrees. He told his mother that what she had done was deeply inappropriate. He told her he was not a man who needed to be managed. He told her that the idea of marrying a woman he had never met, from a background that had nothing in common with his own, arranged by his mother, as though he were incapable of managing his own personal life, was not something he was willing to entertain. He used words like autonomy and paternalism, and he deployed them with the precision of someone who had spent decades winning arguments in rooms full of people who also went to excellent schools. Margaret listened to all of it, and when he was finished, she said very quietly, "The venue is already reserved." And she got up and poured herself another cup of coffee. This is one of the things that people who study human behavior find endlessly fascinating about the dynamic between adult children and their parents, particularly in families where the child has achieved a level of success that far surpasses what the parent experienced. Research consistently shows that no matter how powerful, how wealthy, or how professionally dominant a person becomes, the psychological architecture of their relationship with their mother remains largely unchanged from childhood. Carter Whitfield could silence a boardroom with a single sentence. He could not make his mother put down her coffee cup. The wedding took place on a Saturday in late March, in a small chapel in Harlan that held 80 people and smelled like old wood and candle wax, and the particular kind of permanence that old buildings accumulate over time. The whole town came, which in Harlan meant something different than it would have meant in Greenwich. It meant people brought casseroles. It meant the choir showed up even though no one had officially asked them to. It meant the parking lot overflowed and people left their trucks on the grass and nobody minded. It meant that even on a day that was objectively the most unusual wedding Harlan had ever witnessed, a girl from a local diner marrying a man who arrived in a car that cost more than several of the houses on the street, the community's response was not bewilderment. It was love. Because in Harlan, Lily Mae Harmon was one of their own, and you show up for your own. Carter stood at the altar in a charcoal suit that had been made for him in London, and that fit him with the kind of perfection that signals money without announcing it. His face was the face of a man executing a decision he had been unable to prevent, composed, correct, and entirely somewhere else. He had stopped fighting his mother 3 weeks earlier, not because she had convinced him, but because he had realized, in one of his more honest moments, that the energy he was expending on resistance was energy he didn't have a better use for, and that the fastest way through something you don't want to do is generally to do it. Lily Mae walked down the aisle in a lace dress her mother had helped her find at a bridal shop in Middlesbrough, the next town over. It was simple, and it was beautiful, and it had taken 3 Saturdays of searching to find it. She walked on her father's arm, and her face was, this is the word everyone who was there would later use. It was steady.
I give you my daughter.
Not happy, not
Thank you.
unhappy, not afraid. Steady. Like a woman who had made a decision and had decided to inhabit it fully, which is the only honest way to inhabit any decision you've made. They exchanged rings. A minister said words about commitment and grace and the kind of love that chooses rather than falls. Carter repeated his vows with the accuracy of a man reading from a prepared statement.
This is the kind of
Lily
love
Mae
that
said
chooses
hers
rather
in a
than
voice that was
falls.
barely above
I,
a
Carter,
whisper,
take you, Lily
but
Mae,
that
to be my
carried in the
wife.
silence
I,
of
Lily
that
Mae,
old
take you,
chapel,
Carter, to be my
all
husband.
the way to the back
You may
row.
now kiss the bride.
Afterward, there was food in the fellowship hall, and people danced, and someone played a fiddle, and Carter stood near the door with a glass of water and a look on his face like a man waiting for a meeting that had already run too long. That night, Lily Mae moved into the Greenwich estate, and her real life, the one nobody had told her to prepare for, began. The Whitfield estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, sits at the end of a private road behind iron gates that open by sensor when you approach in the right vehicle. The house has 40 rooms. A library Carter has read perhaps 12 books in. A formal dining room used primarily for business dinners. A kitchen staffed weekday mornings by a cook named Ruth, who had worked for Carter for 9 years. A team of 3 housekeepers. A groundskeeper named Howard, who had been maintaining the garden since before Carter bought the place, and a full-time estate manager named Patricia, who coordinated everything with the efficiency of someone running a small corporation, because she essentially was. Lily Mae arrived with 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of things from her bedroom in Harlan. A few books, a photograph of her family, a small potted plant that had been her grandmother's, and that she had been keeping alive for 6 years, with a consistency that her college roommate would later describe, upon hearing this detail of the story, as more impressive than most things she had encountered in her adult life. She stood in the entryway of the estate on a Sunday evening, her 2 suitcases beside her, and looked up at the staircase that curved to the 2nd floor and the chandelier above it that was the size of a kitchen table. And whatever she felt in that moment, she felt it privately, because there was no one in the entryway to share it with. Carter had gone directly to his study upon arriving home. Patricia had shown Lily Mae to her room, a guest room on the 2nd floor, not the master, because Carter slept in the master and had made no arrangements to alter this, and had given her a brief, professional tour of the house with the manner of someone orienting a new employee, which was, in the most functionally honest sense, not entirely inaccurate. The room was beautiful. It had a window seat and crown molding, and a bathroom with heated floors and towels so thick they felt extravagant. It was also, and this is the detail that matters, entirely impersonal. There were no photographs on the walls. There were no books on the nightstand. There was nothing in that room that said someone lives here. There was only the declaration of a space that cost money to maintain and served a function and expected nothing of you emotionally in return. Lily Mae set her potted plant on the windowsill and hung the photograph of her family on the wall above the desk and unpacked her 2 suitcases into the closet that was large enough to park a car in. And then she sat on the edge of the bed in the expensive, impersonal, beautiful room and was, for the first time since she had agreed to any of this, truly alone with what she had done. She did not call her mother that night, though she wanted to. She did not cry, though she was close. She sat for a while, and then she got up, went to the kitchen, introduced herself to Ruth, and asked if she could make herself a cup of tea. Ruth, who had worked in that house for 9 years and who had seen 4 different personal assistants, 2 different estate managers, and 1 very short-lived live-in girlfriend come and go without any of them once setting foot in the kitchen to ask for something as basic and human as a cup of tea. Ruth looked at this young woman standing in her kitchen in house slippers with a cardigan pulled around her shoulders, and she said, "Sit down, honey. I'll make it." That was the first alliance Lily Mae made in the Whitfield estate. It was also the most important one. The first weeks were defined by an absence. Carter was present in the house the way a painting is present in a museum, occupying space, technically observable, but not engaged with the people around him. He left before 7 in the morning. He returned between 9 and 11 at night. He ate breakfast alone and dinner rarely. He did not seek out Lily Mae. He did not avoid her aggressively. There was no hostility, no coldness directed at her specifically. There was simply nothing, an absence of acknowledgement so total that it functioned, in its own way, as a kind of erasure. And then there were the introductions, or more accurately, the non-introductions. When business associates came to the estate, which happened 4 or 5 times in those first 2 months, Carter introduced every person in the house by name and role except one: the cook, the housekeeper, the estate manager, the groundskeeper, and his wife. Lily Mae was present on 2 of these occasions and heard herself described, in the peripheral, offhand way you describe something you haven't fully acknowledged, as one of the house staff. She stood in those moments and absorbed them and said nothing and let them pass and went back to whatever she had been doing before the guests arrived. People who study the psychology of status, and there is a significant body of research on this subject, have identified something they call status attribution, which is the way we unconsciously assign a person's worth based on the context in which we encounter them. Carter's guests saw a young woman in the kitchen helping with dinner. They placed her accordingly. They did not question it. They did not look more closely. And Carter did not correct them, which was its own kind of statement, one he may or may not have been fully conscious of making. But here is what no one in those rooms noticed. Here is what the research on status and perception consistently fails to account for. Lily Mae noticed everything, and she was deciding. There is a term in psychology called identity anchoring. It describes the capacity of certain individuals to remain connected to their core sense of self even when their environment is actively working to redefine them. It is considered one of the rarest and most powerful expressions of psychological resilience, and it is almost always invisible from the outside, because its defining characteristic is that it requires no audience. The person who possesses it does not perform their strength. They simply live it, consistently, without acknowledgement, without recognition, in rooms where no one is watching and no one is clapping, and no one will ever know what it cost them to stay exactly who they are. Lily Mae Harmon was, without ever having read a psychology textbook or attended a resilience seminar or been the subject of a research study, one of the most complete examples of identity anchoring that behavioral scientists would ever have encountered. She simply did not know how to be anyone other than herself, and in the environment she found herself in, an environment that was doing everything short of telling her directly that who she was did not merit recognition, being herself was the most radical act available to her. She woke at 6 every morning. She helped Ruth with breakfast preparation, not because anyone asked her to, and not to prove anything, but because the kitchen was warm and Ruth was good company, and Lily Mae had grown up in a house where everyone helped, because that was simply what you did. She learned the names of every person who worked on that property within her first week. Howard the groundskeeper, Patricia the estate manager, the 3 housekeepers, Delia, Carmen, and a young woman named Josie who was 18 and working her first job, and who reminded Lily Mae, in ways that made her chest ache quietly, of herself. She learned what each person liked in their coffee. She remembered which days were hard for which people. She noticed that Howard's back hurt on cold mornings, and she started leaving a heating pad on the small bench near the garden shed without being asked and without leaving a note. She did all of this without strategy, without a plan, without the conscious calculation of a woman trying to win anything. She did it because it was the only way she knew how to exist in a space, by making it feel, to the people inside it, like they were worth showing up for. The staff of the Whitfield estate had been, before Lily Mae arrived, professionally courteous to one another and quietly separate. People who work in high-wealth households develop a particular kind of professionalism that functions also as a kind of protection. You do your job well. You stay in your lane. You do not allow yourself to have feelings about the space you are maintaining because the space was never yours to have feelings about. Lily Mae disrupted this without meaning to. She asked people about their families. She listened to the answers and asked follow-up questions the next time she saw them. She laughed easily and genuinely, and the sound of it moved through those enormous marble-floored rooms like something the rooms hadn't heard in a long time and didn't know how much they'd missed. Ruth noticed first. Ruth always noticed first. She had worked in service for 40 years, and she had developed the particular perception of someone who has spent a lifetime being in the room, but not of it. The ability to see the true emotional temperature of a household the way a doctor reads a chart, clearly and without sentiment. And what Ruth saw in those first weeks was the estate changing, subtly, molecularly, the way a room changes when someone opens a window you had forgotten was there. Meals started arriving with more care. The table in the
You all
breakfast
make
room
this
was
look
set more
so
thoughtfully.
easy. Years of
Josie
practice,
began
Lily.
whistling while she
Well,
worked,
you're all wizards.
which she
I
had
mean
never
it.
done before.
Flattery will
And
get you
Carmen
everywhere.
started lingering in the kitchen
Deal.
after her shift to talk, which was also new, and Howard brought in a handful of early spring crocuses from the garden one morning and left them in a small glass on the kitchen counter without explanation, which Ruth understood immediately and which made her eyes go soft in the way they went when something moved her that she hadn't expected. Carter Whitfield noticed none of this. He was busy, the way that certain kinds of loneliness disguise themselves as being busy, and he moved through his own house with the efficiency of a man passing through an airport, purposefully, without looking up, already thinking about the next destination. It was a Tuesday in April, 10 weeks after the wedding, and Carter had returned from a series of back-to-back meetings in Manhattan that had started at 7 in the morning and concluded, after a dinner with a European investor that ran 2 hours longer than scheduled, at 11:45 at night. He was tired in the particular way that comes not just from a long day, but from a long sequence of days stacked on top of each other, like plates that have been loaded past their capacity, each one held in place by the one below it, the whole stack requiring constant attention so nothing crashes. He came in through the side entrance, as he always did, and walked through the mudroom and into the kitchen to get a glass of water before going upstairs. There was a dish on the counter. It was covered with a cloth to keep it warm. Beside it was a note, folded in half, with his name written on the front, in handwriting he didn't recognize because he had never seen Lily Mae's handwriting before. He almost didn't open it. He almost kept walking. The glass of water was right there. The stairs were 20 feet away. His bed was a floor up and a hallway down, and sleep was the only thing he had been looking forward to since the investor dinner had extended itself into its second hour at a restaurant he would not have chosen and could not leave. He was this close, to walking past a covered dish on his own kitchen counter, without allowing it to be anything other than a covered dish on his kitchen counter. He picked up the note. It said, "I heard you tell your driver last month that your mother used to make chicken and dumplings on the hard weeks. I asked Ruth for the closest recipe she knew. I made it tonight. I hope the week gets easier." And then it was signed with a single initial, L. He stood in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet around him in the way that large, expensive houses are quiet. Completely, almost aggressively, like silence that costs something. He lifted the cloth from the dish. Steam rose, slow and steady, carrying a smell that was so specifically and immediately associated in his body with the sensation of being taken care of, that it caught him somewhere below his sternum before he could reason his way around it. His mother had made this when he was sick, when school was hard. On the December afternoon, when his father's test results had come back wrong, she had made it and set it in front of him, and sat across the table, and not said anything, because she understood, as some mothers do, that the words were less important than the act, that the soup was the sentence, that showing up with warm food was the most complete thing she knew how to offer. He sat down at the kitchen island at midnight in his expensive suit, and he ate alone, and he did not think about any of the things he had been thinking about since 7 that morning. He did not go looking for Lily Mae. He did not knock on her door to say thank you. He put the dish in the sink and went to bed. But something had shifted in him, in the particular quiet way that the most significant shifts happen, not with announcement, not with clarity, not in a way he could have named or explained, or would have been willing to admit to if anyone had asked. Something had moved. The researchers at Florida State University, who published a study on marital satisfaction, found something that runs counter to most of what we are told about successful relationships. They found that the traits most associated with long-term marital stability were not the obvious ones. Not passion, not shared interests, not even compatibility in the traditional sense. They were steadiness, consistency, the quiet accumulation of small, reliable acts that tell another person, over time, and without speeches, I see you. I am here, and I will still be here tomorrow. The researchers called these acts relationship deposits. Small investments, the daily, unglamorous work of building something that holds. Lily Mae had been making deposits in an account Carter didn't know he had. He began to notice her in the way you notice something that has been there all along, once you finally stop moving fast enough for it to catch your eye. He noticed that the quality of the air in his house had changed. Not literally, not in a way he could measure, but the house felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the decor, which hadn't changed, or the staff, who were the same, or the temperature, which Patricia maintained with the same precision as always. It felt inhabited in a way it hadn't before. It felt, and he turned this word over in his mind because it was not a word he was accustomed to applying to a property valued at $7.4 million. It felt like someone lived there. He started coming home earlier. Not dramatically, not in a way he announced or explained. He would leave a meeting 30 minutes before he had to, citing traffic that he knew would not be there, and use the time to drive home the long way along the water. He would find reasons to work from his home office on days when the commute to Manhattan was optional. He would linger in the kitchen in the morning for 10 minutes longer than necessary, doing something on his phone that he was not actually concentrating on, while Lily Mae and Ruth moved around each other with the comfortable choreography of women who had found their rhythm in the same space. He said good morning to her on a Wednesday, 6 weeks after the chicken and dumplings, and she said good morning back with the same warmth she said it to everyone. And the simple, unremarkable normalcy of the exchange did something to him that he found embarrassing and did not examine too closely. He asked Ruth the following Friday what Lily Mae did during the days when he was in the city, and Ruth told him, with the careful neutrality of a woman who had been watching this unfold and had formed strong opinions about it that she was keeping entirely to herself, that Lily Mae helped around the house, that she had started a small garden in the back corner of the grounds with Howard's permission, and that she had been visiting the senior center in town on Thursday mornings and reading to a group of residents there, which she had arranged herself without telling anyone. Carter was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Arranged that herself?" And Ruth said yes. She just walked in one day and asked if they'd like a reader. Apparently they said yes before she finished the sentence. He went to his study and sat at his desk and did not open his laptop for 11 minutes, which was, in Carter Whitfield's professional life, approximately the equivalent of someone else taking a 3-hour nap. He was thinking about the research he had done, years ago, on the behavioral economics of value assessment, specifically the phenomenon researchers call the evaluation gap, which describes the consistent human tendency to undervalue what is readily available to us and overvalue what we have to work to obtain. He had made a career out of identifying this gap in markets. He had made himself wealthy by understanding that the most valuable assets are often the ones the market hasn't correctly priced yet, because the market is distracted by things that are louder and more obvious. He had spent 25 years finding undervalued things in the world around him, and it was occurring to him, slowly and with the particular discomfort of a man who is very smart encountering his own blind spot, that he had missed one. The garden was Lily Mae's idea. She had asked Howard about it in her second week at the estate, standing at the back window of the kitchen and looking at the immaculate formal grounds. All symmetry and precision. Everything growing exactly where it was supposed to. Nothing wild. Nothing that hadn't been planned. She had asked Howard if there was a corner somewhere, a patch he wasn't using, where something less formal might be possible. Howard had looked at her for a moment, the way people look at someone when they're not sure yet whether to take them seriously. And then he had taken her to the far back corner of the property, past the formal garden and the outdoor furniture that nobody ever sat on, to a strip of ground along the stone wall that got good afternoon light and that he had never been asked to do anything with. She started with collard greens, which she had been growing since she was a child in her mother's backyard in Harlan. She added tomatoes in April, zucchini in May, a row of sunflowers along the stone wall that would not be ready until August, but that she planted anyway, because planting something in April that won't bloom until August is an act of optimism that deserves to be named. Howard started checking on her progress on mornings when he didn't have other tasks, and then on mornings when he did. He started offering advice about soil acidity and drainage and the particular temperament of northeastern summers. And at some point that neither of them could pinpoint precisely, the garden stopped being Lily Mae's project and became something they were both tending. Carter saw her in the garden for the first time on a Saturday morning in early May. Through the glass wall of his study, where he was supposed to be reviewing a due diligence report, she was on her knees in the dirt, hair tied back, wearing a pair of gardening gloves that were already past rescue, talking to Howard about something that made both of them laugh. He watched for longer than he intended to. The report sat open on the desk beside him, unread. The following Saturday, he went outside. He told himself he was going to inspect the grounds, which was something he had not done in 3 years, and which the grounds did not require, but which was a reasonable enough pretext that he could deploy it without examining it too closely. He walked the perimeter of the formal garden. He looked at the fountain, which was working correctly. He rounded the corner of the hedgerow and found himself standing at the edge of the back garden, and Lily Mae was there, on her knees again, planting something, and she looked up when she heard him and said good morning with the same unhurried warmth she said it to everyone, and waited, without any apparent expectation, to see what he would do next. He looked at what she was planting. He asked what it was. She told him they were collard greens. She said they grow fast, they don't need much, and they are very hard to kill. She said it simply, as a fact, and went back to what she was doing. And Carter Whitfield stood in the morning light, in his Connecticut garden, and did something he had not done in a professional context in longer than he could remember. He stood there without an agenda, without a next move, without a follow-up question designed to keep him in control of the conversation. He just stood there, in the sunlight, next to his wife, and let himself be somewhere without immediately trying to manage it. He crouched down beside her and picked up the small trowel from the ground, and she looked at him, just briefly, with a flicker of something careful in her eyes, as though she was aware that this moment could collapse under too much attention, that it needed to be held lightly, and he asked her, quietly, if she wanted help. She handed him the trowel. There is a concept in social psychology called the pratfall effect, first identified by researcher Elliot Aronson in 1966. It describes the phenomenon whereby a highly competent person becomes more likable, not less, when they reveal a human vulnerability or make a mistake. The theory is that perfection creates distance, and distance creates disconnection. And what we crave from the people in our lives is not their invulnerability, but their willingness to be human in our presence. Carter Whitfield was, in almost every measurable way, a highly competent person who had spent decades curating an image of invulnerability so complete that no one around him, not his colleagues, not his employees, not the women he had dated briefly and never seriously over the years, had ever seen him be uncertain, had ever seen him not know what to do next, had ever seen him pick up a trowel in a garden and plant a vegetable he had never planted before because a woman had handed it to him and he had, without deciding to, wanted to. The garden was the pratfall, and Lily Mae, who had never heard of Elliot Aronson and would not have cared about him if she had, understood instinctively what the research had been saying for decades, that the way you reach a person who has built walls is not to attack the walls. It is to create a space so safe, so consistently warm, so free of judgment or performance, that the person inside the walls eventually comes to the window themselves, just to see what it feels like to let in some air. She had not done any of this strategically. That is the part that defies easy categorization. The social scientists who study behavior and influence and persuasion spend a great deal of time on intent, on the difference between someone who is being kind in order to achieve an outcome and someone who is simply kind and the outcome arrives as a consequence. Lily Mae belongs to the second category so completely that the first one would have been literally foreign to her. She had not been patient with Carter's coldness because she was playing a long game. She had been patient because she was patient. She had made chicken and dumplings not because she had calculated that it would create an emotional opening, but because she had heard a man mention his mother's cooking and had thought, I can do something about that. She had started a garden not as a metaphor for growth and renewal in a struggling relationship, but because the formal grounds made her chest feel tight and she needed somewhere she could put her hands in the ground. The outcomes of her character were not her character's purpose. They were simply what happened when a person of genuine quality was placed in a situation that would have diminished someone less certain of themselves. When you do not need validation from a specific source, you are free to simply be. And when you are free to simply be, you become, paradoxically, the most interesting person in any room, because you are not performing, And performance is what everyone around you has been watching for so long, they've forgotten what the absence of it feels like. Carter had been surrounded by performance his entire professional life. People performed competence for him. They performed confidence. They performed loyalty, enthusiasm, deference. They had performed romantic interest, in the years when he had allowed that, with a transparency that he had recognized and that had confirmed something he believed about himself, that people's behavior toward him was always, on some level, about what he could provide. He had not believed this bitterly. He had believed it empirically, the way you believe something that has been demonstrated to you consistently enough that it stops registering as a belief and starts registering as a fact. Lily Mae had demonstrated something different, not through argument, not through grand gesture, through the steady, daily, unremarkable accumulation of actions that had nothing to gain from him and expected nothing in return. And this, for a man whose entire worldview was built on the architecture of incentives, was the most destabilizing thing that had ever happened to him. The first time Carter introduced Lily Mae as his wife, it was in front of his two senior partners, James Farrow and Nathan Cole, who had been with Whitfield Capital for 11 and 8 years respectively, and who had attended the wedding, and who had, in the months since, been waiting with the patience of men who had worked with Carter long enough to know that forcing his hand on anything personal was a reliable way to ensure it never happened. They were in the kitchen on a Saturday afternoon in June, having come out from the city for an informal working session that Carter occasionally held at the estate. Lily Mae had brought
Here's
coffee out
some
from the
coffee.
kitchen without being asked,
Lily Mae,
because
this
she
is
had heard
James and
voices,
Nathan,
and because
my wife.
bringing people coffee
It's
was
so
the kind
lovely
of
to
thing
meet
she
you
did.
both.
And
The
Carter
pleasure
had
is
looked
ours,
up
Lily
from the
Mae,
documents on
indeed.
the table and said, with what appeared to be casualness, but that James Farrow would later describe to his wife as actually the most careful sentence Carter had ever spoken in front of him, "This is Lily Mae." My wife, James Farrow, said it was nice to finally properly meet her. Nathan Cole said the coffee was excellent. Lily Mae
it's
said she
nice
was
to
glad they
finally
could make it
properly
out
meet
from
you.
the city
The coffee is
and
excellent.
asked if anyone
I'm
needed
glad you could
anything
make it out
else.
from the city.
And then
Does
she
anyone
went
need
back
anything
inside.
else?
No,
And
we're all
Carter
set.
watched her go
Thanks.
with an
No, thank
expression
you.
that James Farrow filed away and did not bring up until 4 years later, at Carter's 50th birthday dinner, when he told the story to the table and said, "I've known this man for 11 years, and I had never once seen him look at anything the way he looked at her walking back through that door." The changes after that were not cinematic. They did not happen the way they happen in films, with a climactic scene and a declaration and a resolution that arrives with music. They happened the way things actually change in real lives, slowly, quietly, in accumulations so gradual that you can't always identify the moment when one thing became another thing. Carter started asking Ruth what Lily Mae had done that day, and then he started asking Lily Mae herself. He started coming home for dinner. Not every night. He was still, fundamentally, a man who worked too much, and this did not change overnight, and perhaps never changed completely. But on the nights he came home before 7, he started eating at the kitchen table with Lily Mae, instead of in his study alone. And the conversations they had at that table were, in the beginning, careful and brief, and slightly awkward in the way that conversations are, when two people are finding their footing. And then they were less careful. And then they were not brief. And then one evening in July, they sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours after the dishes were cleared, and talked about his father, which was something Carter Whitfield had not done with anyone in more than 2 decades, and Lily Mae listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without rushing toward resolution, without offering more comfort than was asked for. And when he was finished, she said, "He sounds like he would have been proud of you." And Carter was quiet for a long time, and then he said, "I think he would have liked you." And Lily Mae said, "I think I would have liked him too." They were, by October, in the full, complicated, imperfect, genuine sense of the word, beginning. Beginning in the way that late-starting things begin, with the particular seriousness of two people who are old enough to know what they are building, and deliberate enough finally to build it carefully. We tell ourselves a lot of stories about power, about who has it, how it looks, what it sounds like when it enters a room. We have been taught, most of us, from a very early age, to associate power with the things that are visible: wealth, title, presence, the particular confidence that comes from knowing that the world is structured in your favor. We have been taught to read the signals of power in the things that cost money, and the people who project authority, and the voices that speak first and loudest in every room. And then we encounter someone like Lily Mae Harmon, and everything we thought we understood about power has to be renegotiated. Because what Lily Mae had, and I want to be very precise about this, because it is the entire point of this story, was not the absence of power. It was a form of power so complete, so self-contained, so entirely independent of external validation, that it required nothing from the world around it to maintain itself. She did not need Carter to see her in order to be worth seeing. She did not need to be introduced correctly in order to know who she was. She did not need approval, acknowledgement, or even basic courtesy in order to continue showing up, fully and consistently, as herself. This is not a small thing. This is, in fact, one of the most difficult things a human being can do. And most of us, if we are honest, cannot do it for an afternoon, let alone for months, in an environment that is doing its level best to convince us we don't matter. The research on women and status in high-wealth environments is illuminating in a way that is also a little devastating. A landmark study published by the Russell Sage Foundation examined 25 women married to men of significant wealth and found that in the majority of cases, these women had internalized a profound minimization of their own economic and personal agency. Not because they were told to, but because the structures of their environment made self-minimization feel like the path of least resistance. The women in that study learned to downplay what they knew, to defer to what their partners wanted, to understand their role primarily in terms of what they supported rather than who they were. And the researchers noted, carefully and with compassion, that this was not weakness, it was adaptation. It was what happened to women who were placed in environments that consistently communicated, your value here is contingent, your presence here is conditional, you are allowed to be here as long as you don't take up too much space. Lily Mae Harmon took up exactly the amount of space she had always taken up. No more, no less. She did not shrink to fit the environment. She did not expand aggressively to resist it. She simply remained herself, at the same volume and the same temperature, and with the same fundamental warmth she had carried from Harlan, Kentucky, through the chapel in March, through the guest room on the second floor with the heated floors and the impersonal towels, through the kitchen and the garden, and the Tuesday mornings at the senior center, and the back corner of the property where the collard greens grew fast and needed very little and were very hard to kill. She was very hard to kill. Carter Whitfield did not fall in love with Lily Mae because she was patient. He did not fall in love with her because she was kind, or because she made good food, or because she turned his household into a warmer place. He fell in love with her, and this is the distinction that matters, because in a life full of people who performed themselves for his benefit, she was the only person who had simply been herself for no benefit at all. And that, for a man who had spent his entire adult life calculating incentives, was not just attractive. It was revolutionary. Margaret Whitfield, when asked later by a journalist who had gotten hold of the story why she had made the decision she made, why she had gone to Kentucky, why she had found Lily Mae, why she had arranged a marriage for a grown man without his consent, said something that I think is worth sitting with. She said, "I didn't go to Kentucky to find my son a wife. I went to Kentucky to find my son a mirror, someone who would reflect back to him what he was actually missing. I knew what he needed. I just needed to find someone honest enough to show him." She found exactly that. And the woman she found had been there all along, in a small town 4 hours from the nearest airport, working the morning shift at a diner, folding laundry on a porch, keeping her grandmother's plant alive, asking nothing of the world and offering everything to it. Lily Mae Harmon never asked for any of it. The marriage, the mansion, the slow, uncertain, ultimately beautiful process of being loved by someone who had forgotten they were allowed to love anyone. She never asked for it, and she never chased it, and she never performed for it, and it came to her anyway, because the things that are real, truly real, do not require performance. They require only that you remain exactly who you are, in every room, at every temperature, with or without an audience, whether anyone is watching or not. That is the whole of it. That is what she never asked for, and that is what she got. Before we go any further into our next story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own life, your own patience, your own quiet strength, Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, and drop a comment below with one word, just one word, that describes Lily Mae to you. I want to see what you come up with. Here is what I want you to take away from this story. Not the romance, not the mansion, not the fact that it ended well, because not all of them do, and the ending is not the point. I want you to take away Lily Mae's ordinary mornings, the ones where no one was watching, the ones where she had every reason to be bitter and every right to feel erased, and she chose, instead, to make soup, to learn someone's name, to carry a heating pad to a shed where an old man's back hurt in the cold, to get on her knees in a corner of someone else's property and plant something she would tend for months before it was ready. Those ordinary mornings are the story. Everything else is just what grew from them. There is a version of strength that the world celebrates loudly, the kind that wins arguments, that commands rooms, that demands recognition and gets it. And then there is this other kind, the kind that doesn't need the room to be quiet before it speaks, the kind that doesn't wait for permission to be itself. The kind that shows up the same way on a Monday when everything is going wrong as it does on a Saturday when everything is fine. The kind that plants things in April it won't see bloom until August and waters them anyway. Most of us are not Lily Mae. Most of us, if we are honest, would have cracked somewhere in those first 10 weeks. We would have made a phone call we would later regret. We would have said something at a dinner party that we meant to be dignified but came out as wounded. We would have stopped tending the garden because the person we wanted to tend it for wasn't looking. And there is no shame in that. That is human. That is what it feels like to need people to show you that you matter. But Lily Mae didn't need that. And the reason she didn't need it is not because she was extraordinary in the way that extraordinary people are extraordinary in stories. Gifted, fated, chosen. She was extraordinary in the way that the best people are extraordinary, because of what she had been given by ordinary people in an ordinary place who understood, without anyone writing it down for them, that the most important thing you can pass on to a child is the unshakable knowledge that their worth is not negotiable, that it does not go up when they are praised and down when they are dismissed, that it simply is fixed and permanent, the way the mountains behind Harlan are fixed and permanent, indifferent to whatever the weather decides to do. Her parents gave her that. Her community gave her that. And she carried it into a 40-room house in Greenwich, Connecticut, and set it down on the windowsill like a potted plant that had been her grandmother's, and she kept it alive. She never asked for any of it. She never had to. Because what she was always going to be enough. The world just needed to get quiet enough to hear it.